Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Akshay. We are so excited that all of you are here for our first Bees Bookshelf author talk with Amy Nathan, the author of Together. If any of you are not registered for our book club, you can find out more at the link in the chat. It's spellingbee.com/book-club. Before I introduce our author today, I would like to go over the procedure for asking questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a little dialogue bubble marked Q&A. It's next to the chat one, but please use the Q&A button. And if you have a question to ask during the talk, please click that button and type it in. And at the end of the talk, we'll pass questions on for the author to answer. And now, without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today. And it is my pleasure to introduce our author. Amy Nathan has written several books for adults, as well as others for teenagers and young readers. And the subjects include women's history, civil rights, dance, music, kids' allowances, and how to make practicing a musical instrument less of a hassle for kids and grown-ups. However, all of her books have something in common. They introduce readers to amazing people whose stories have inspired her, and hopefully will spur readers to keep following their dreams no matter what kinds of obstacles may pop up from time to time. And two of those inspiring people are Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson, who are the subjects of the book Together, which she's going to talk to us about today. In the book, Keith Plessy talks about being a little kid who was bored in history class and drawing instead of listening or taking notes. And I'll admit, I was like that too in history class because I wasn't sure how most of what I was learning was relevant to my life. And what I really loved about this book was how it went back and forth across time to show two ordinary people becoming aware of the legacy of American history in their lives, and then also using that knowledge to do something positive in their community. And now I will pass it over to Amy Nathan.
Oh, well, thank you, Akshay. Can you hear me? Good? Good. Well, thank you, Akshay, and thank you, Scripps National Spelling Bee, for bringing us together today to talk about the book Together and how to introduce it to students. I'm going to screen share now and show a brief PowerPoint on the book, and then we'll open it up to questions and a discussion. But first, I want to say that I have such admiration for young people who can do well on spelling bees. I lost my 6th grade spelling bee by misspelling the word angle, mixing it up with the word angel. And so I'm sure your young people probably won't do that. So I'm really admiring all the work that you are doing with your young people to prepare them for the spelling bee. So, as its name suggests, the book Together is about bringing people together. It describes an effort by people today to do that in order to help undo some of the damage caused by a devastating historic event that took place 125 years ago, an event that literally drove people apart. So to help readers feel, and I'm going to try to advance this, to help readers feel the need for working together, the book takes a personal approach to telling about that historic event by presenting it through the eyes of two people we meet in chapter 1 as young children. And here they are on the book's first page with their 2nd grade school photos of Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson. The historic event that they help us learn about involves an ancestor of each of them. Keith's famous ancestor was his great-grandfather's cousin, Homer Plessy, a black man arrested in 1892 in New Orleans for sitting in a train car for white passengers. Phoebe's ancestor was her great-great-grandfather, John Howard Ferguson, a judge who ruled against Homer Plessy in New Orleans, causing the case to go on to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was at the Supreme Court that their last names became linked in history in the famous 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case. That's the historical event that this book describes. The Supreme Court also ruled against Homer Plessy, giving its stamp of approval to the idea of separate but equal. That separating people by skin color was okay if the separate facilities provided for black people were equal to those provided for whites. But as we all know, they almost never were equal. And that decision helped unleash more than 50 years of Jim Crow segregation. So these images on this slide come from Chapter 6. They show examples of Jim Crow, ones that are easily captured in photos of separate buses, separate streetcar and movie theater seats, even separate doctor's offices. Chapter 7 describes how Jim Crow segregation was officially ended with new laws in the 1960s, but the book explains that despite those laws, Jim Crow-era attitudes and policies still have a negative impact on life today. However, we don't mention that historic case in the book until the end of Chapter 4, and instead the book starts with the personal approach. The personal approach is actually emphasized before throughout reading the book in the teacher's guide, which is available on the publisher's website. I think there's a lot of links that I'm giving during the talk today, and they're going to be put in the chat for you, so you don't have to worry about copying them down. So in the teacher's guide, I suggest that teachers might want to emphasize with students finding their personal reaction to the material presented in the book with what I call the hashtag project, that they sum up their feelings of what's presented in each chapter with a hashtag at the end of each chapter. And that hashtag project can start even before they start reading the book with the cover. So I suggest that, teachers and parents and librarians could help students look at the cover and try to figure out who is this young man supposed to be, what message is the artist sending. And this artist was I.O. Scott from a mural he did in Plessy Park in New Orleans. So I tried to think of some hashtags, and I'm sure you and your young people will be able to think up much better ones. So then we go back to the personal approach as we head into Chapter 1 with hearing about Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson. In Chapter 1, they each describe their first encounters with segregation, which caused problems for both of them, puzzled them, and they didn't quite understand what those rules were all about. So for Keith, his first encounter with segregation came in a park in his neighborhood, St. Roch Park. He said, "I was never allowed to play there as a child on Saturdays and Sundays. Only white kids could play there on weekends. We had to squeeze in our playing after school before it got dark. As a child, I was always questioning things when it came to the color of a person's skin, why people who were considered to be white got better treatment than others." He also recalled not being waited on by storekeepers when he went to the local stores. And so his mother's advice for that was, well, don't go to stores that don't treat you fairly. She said, don't let anyone take your sunshine away from you. He was also puzzled about why the school he attended had to be created by the Black community, because the city's school board didn't provide a school in his neighborhood for Black children. Now, Phoebe also was puzzled by segregation. She encountered it when she went to a movie theater at about age 6 with her African-American babysitter, Minnie Lou Williams. The man at the theater told Minnie that I could sit downstairs at the movie, said Phoebe, but Minnie had to sit upstairs. She said, I certainly wasn't going to go to the movies without her or sit in another place. We walked home in total silence, holding hands. I remember feeling really sad and not understanding. Another example happened when Minnie took Phoebe to the local amusement park, and Phoebe could sit on a horse on the park's carousel, but Minnie wasn't allowed to. The carousel was only for white people. These rules, Phoebe said, seemed to her definitely confusing and not fair. At the end of the first chapter, we note that both Keith and Phoebe did meet as adults, and by then they had both learned something amazing, that a member of their families had met 65 years before they were born, and that this 1892 meeting in a Louisiana courtroom helped explain the rules that troubled them as children. The follow-up activity for this chapter, as suggested in the teaching guide, is to ask kids, well, how might these experiences affect Keith and Phoebe? I got that wrong. Keith and Phoebe as they grow up. And when did you first realize that skin color can affect how some people are treated by others? And how did that realization make you feel? Maybe you might want to share your own first experiences with segregation when we get to the discussion session. So the next few chapters of the book, present the history that brings their relatives together. So I'm going to just go through really briefly the content of those chapters, and I have in the links in the chat an outline that I give a good outline of what's in each chapter. In chapter 2, we meet Homer Plessy. There are no photographs of Homer Plessy, so instead I used this picture of a young teenager who portrayed Homer Plessy in a play that was created by the teenagers, in which they tried to find links to their own life of the Homer Plessy story. And that can suggest right away to the book's readers that it is possible for young people to find a personal connection to the story. Now, chapter 2 covers a roller coaster ride of emotions. It starts before the Civil War, when free people of color in Louisiana had few rights and enslaved people had none at all. Then it describes the hope-filled period right after the Civil War, when people of color gained new rights from 3 amendments added to the U.S. Constitution that included voting rights and the end of slavery. A new Louisiana Constitution in 1868 established integrated schools in New Orleans, something no other southern city had, and not many northern ones either at that time. Streetcars and trains were integrated, but this hope-filled era soon ended as white supremacists, aided by Ku Klux Klan-like violence, regained control. Integrated schools came to an end, and in 1890, the Louisiana legislature passed the Separate Car Act that segregated trains again. The Black community decided it had to challenge that law to try to prevent more such laws being passed, and Homer Plessy, age 29, agreed to be arrested to launch a test case against that law. Now, chapters 3 and 4 describe the incredible civil rights movement that a group of citizens in New Orleans, the Citizens Committee, launched to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act. And you'll notice in the illustration that I include at the beginning of this chapter is also by I.O. Scott from his mural in Plessy Park. All the signs in this picture have the writing going backwards. That's the way it must have felt to Black people in 1890, that history was going backwards with rights being snatched away. Chapter 5 describes the courtroom showdown at the U.S. Supreme Court, and the rise and fall of Separate but Equal is presented in chapter 6. In addition to things like streetcar segregation and movie theater examples, it also briefly describes official new Jim Crow policies that had long-lasting impact. So just 2 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, Louisiana officials wrote a new constitution in 1898, which the state's governor boasted said, "White supremacy, for which we have so long struggled, is now crystallized into the Constitution." That Constitution guaranteed Jim Crow a long future by making it nearly impossible for Black men to vote, with a tricky, impossible-to-pass reading test that applied only to Black men. Before 1898, nearly half of Louisiana voters were Black. By 1910, less than 1% were. That 1898 Constitution also allowed non-unanimous jury convictions for a felony, something that only one other state allowed, Oregon, making it easier to convict Black men who were often arrested for minor infractions. That non-unanimous jury rule continued for 120 years. It ended only 3 years ago. Chapter 6 also describes the long-lasting impact of neighborhood segregation and redlining rules that made it hard for Black families to become homeowners and build familial wealth. So as you can see, Jim Crow's reach was wide and long-lasting. Now, chapter 7 describes the official end of Jim Crow, helped by New Orleans lawsuits filed by its lead NAACP lawyer, A.P. Turow, that chipped away gradually at Jim Crow bit by bit, as well as the new national policies of Brown versus Board of Education, which is shown here in another of I.O. Scott's illustrations from his mural, that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and the 1960 laws of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Law. although as we pointed out in the book, Jim Crow's impact lingers on today. Chapter 7 also describes positive gains, with Black officials now holding office in New Orleans. Confederate statues came down there in 2017, and today streets named for slaveholders are getting new names. And in the follow-up to Chapter 1, we point out that City Park Carousel and St. Roch Park were open to all, or at least they were before COVID shut everything down. Chapters 8 to 11 describe the flip on the script that Keith and Phoebe did in 2009, and more about that later. So here and there throughout the history chapters of the book, we refer back to Keith and Phoebe, talking about when they first learned about their connection to the case. And they both first learned about it in 5th grade. Keith said all we had in that history book in 5th grade, though, was that he refused to get out of his seat as some kind of a random act. It didn't go into the details, the team of people behind him, that it was actually a civil rights movement that was going on then. He says later, as Akshay pointed out, that I didn't take it by the horns and find out everything about Homer Plessy. I hated history. Every time the subject came up in a class, I would draw pictures, he said. He didn't really learn exactly how he was connected to the case until he was in his late 30s, in 1996, when he was contacted by Keith Weldon Medley, who was doing research then for a book he wrote on the Plessy case. Medley's research showed that Keith Plessy's great-grandfather's cousin was Homer Plessy. And from Medley, he also learned about the amazing effort of the Citizens Committee and all that went into getting the case to the Supreme Court. Now, Keith says, I can't forget anything I hear about history. It has become a part of me. So that same year, he and his family participated in the 100th anniversary of the Plessy case. And there he is with his whole family, his wife, his 2 daughters, his father, and his cousin. And he's now making plans for how to observe the 125th anniversary this May of that decision. Now, Phoebe also first learned about the case in 5th grade, but she said, she thought, well, I'm from New Orleans, I have that name, but she didn't bother to learn more. And she said nobody had talked about it at home. My mother was a big liberal and tried to help Black women get the vote in New Orleans and was on the right side of trying to integrate the schools there. But she never mentioned to her that her great-great-grandfather was the judge in the Plessy case. Phoebe is sure that if her mother had known that Judge Ferguson was a relative, she would have said something about it. My father's family was very conservative. My father was an only child, she said. He died young. I don't think my dad knew, or if he did, he kept it quiet. It wasn't mentioned in my father's obituary in the newspaper when he died that he was related to the judge. And by 5th grade, Phoebe was living in California with her mother after her father's death. But she didn't really learn how she was related to the judge until she was in her 40s, when she got a surprise phone call to her house in New York from someone who was buying Judge Ferguson's old house in New Orleans and was contacting anyone he could find named Ferguson. She had just received an envelope from her sister containing family history that she hadn't opened yet. So right there on the phone, she opened the envelope, and sure enough, there she was, related to Judge Ferguson, who was her great-great-grandfather. She said that a part of my family helped start Jim Crow is kind of a load to carry. So she traveled back to New Orleans to try to search archives to find out why he did that. And while she was searching, she learned about Keith Weldon Medley's new book, contacted him, and he suggested she come to a book signing. And that's where he introduced her to Keith Plessy. And that's where they first met in 2004 at the book signing for that book about the Homer Plessy case. So she felt so embarrassed meeting someone named Plessy that she started apologizing for what her great-great-grandfather had done. And Keith Plessy just laughed and said, "You weren't alive during that time. I wasn't either. It's time for us to change that whole narrative." So he invited her to come to his house to have lunch with his family the next day, and they became friends right away. And their friends were quite puzzled that, how in the world could someone named Plessy be friends with someone named Ferguson? But they were also surprised by how some other friends reacted to their getting together, seeing it as a kind of a reconciliation, a national reconciliation. And so Phoebe moved back to New Orleans, and they decided to build on that feeling of reconciliation that their coming together symbolized, and they and their friends created the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, which is committed to teaching the history of the landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson, its historic impact on African Americans, and how we can learn from the past to create a more just and equitable future. So here's their first event that they did with the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, creating a historical marker near where Homer Plessy was arrested. And you look on that marker, and behind these members of their family who are gathered there, it's chock full of information, and there's the same amount of information on the backside of their marker. They do markers that are full of information, and they were both trained as visual artists. Phoebe went to art school and was a professional photographer, and they chose a visual way to tell history, to make it accessible to people when they're just walking down the street. They'll come across the historical marker and learn history that way. They've done 5 historical markers so far, and the text of all the markers is in the book. And they also do events for Plessy Day, which is June 7th every year. That's the date in 1892 when Homer Plessy was arrested. And on Plessy Day on 2010 is when those teenagers that I talked to you about earlier, they did their play called Separate, in which they did this at a workshop for 6 weeks at NOCA, the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, where they tried to explore and go into how ideas of othering and being separated from others affected them as they were growing up. And so they just wrote the skits themselves that they acted out in the play. So this young woman marching forward is talking about the feeling that she doesn't really fit in with any group that is vying for her attentions. And the kids said that working on this play really helped them look at people differently. As one boy said, I would definitely defend them now, not laugh at someone who seemed different. So in the teaching guide, I suggest that maybe this is an activity that could be done in class, to write write poetry or draw artwork about how the idea of being separated from others has affected the teenagers. There's a lot of ways that art is presented in the book. All the images from I.O. Scott's mural, plus there's this wonderful drawing that a 5th grader did when Keith and Phoebe went to do a school visit at his school. He drew that picture, which was supposed to symbolize Keith and Phoebe. And Keith Plessy was invited to go back to his elementary school and draw portraits on the wall of Black heroes. So I suggest in the teacher's guide that might be something to ask students, what would you draw if you were invited to go back and draw murals on your elementary school's wall? And he also drew this picture of his great-great-grandfather from a photograph that his cousin had. So, but this book, I realize, for younger students is a bit of a read. So I suggest that for some students may really want to read the whole book. And I really tell the history in a very readable way. Lots of pictures, sidebars, but I can understand that some students might not want to do that. So you might want to suggest that everybody read chapter 1. And really, everybody would probably enjoy reading chapters 8 to 11 about them getting together and making this foundation. And the beginning of chapters 4 and 6, they talk about learning about it in 5th grade. But I really hope that you might convince your students to read some of the history, because there's some really wonderful details in it. I'm just going to try to tempt you with a few of them. In chapter 2, there's a description of the largest slavery rebellion in U.S. history, 1811, in New Orleans, when more than 500 people marched to try to take over New Orleans, and before they were stopped by federal troops and armed plantation owners. And this is a picture of a reenactment of that uprising, that march to New Orleans in 2019. In chapters 3 and 4, it talks about this wonderful work that the Citizens Committee did, but also this strong friendship that developed between a black lawyer and a white lawyer. Black lawyer was Louis Martinet, who was one of the leaders of the Citizens Committee, and the white lawyer was Albion Tourget. There's no photograph of Louis Martinet, so I couldn't include that. But they never met in person, but Albion Tourget was a strong defender of black rights, and he volunteered to be their legal advisor for free. He was located in upstate New York. Martinet was in New Orleans. They never met, but they wrote letters back and forth and telegrams back and forth to each other. And some of their letters I include in the book. Those really heartfelt messages that they exchanged with each other, and especially the one on 53 and 57, they really sound like they could be written today. Chapter 5 gives the arguments that Tourget used at the Supreme Court, and the lone dissenter in the case, John Marshall Harlan, and the quote from his dissent, which is considered one of the most quoted comments by any Supreme Court justice, when he said, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In the respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." Chapter 5 also gives the quotes from the Citizens Committee in their final report that they issued after they lost at the Supreme Court, that they said, "We as free men still believe that we were right and our cause is sacred." And Rodolphe Dedon, one of the members, he wrote, "We think it is more noble and dignified to fight, no matter what, than to show a passive attitude of resignation." And when you think about it, they did ultimately win with Brown versus Board of Education overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. And in chapter 7, I present this case that persuaded the Supreme Court to reach that ruling that there's no role for separate but equal in public education. And that was this study done by Doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark, the doll study, the famous doll study. And I describe it in the book. And if you discuss this with your students, you will definitely have some interesting discussions. So I won't tempt you with any more examples from the book. And we can maybe talk about some more when we have our discussion after the end of the PowerPoint. And there are other activities provided in the teaching guide. I won't describe them. You can find them in the teaching guide. But one I just want to highlight is about having students write historical markers. Now, historical markers all have the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why, just like the lead sentence in a newspaper article. So I thought this might be a new way for teachers to assess students' mastery of a topic in history, is to have the students write a historical marker about it. So, but I want to leave you with one last idea after I'll show you this screen. This is where all the links are to the things that I've mentioned in the PowerPoint, if you want to take a picture of it, but it is also in the chat. But I leave you with one story from the book, that in 1997, just after Keith Plessy learned about his connection to Homer Plessy, he happened to meet Rosa Parks at the hotel where he was working. And he said he went down on one knee before her and thanked her for all that she had done for civil rights. And Rosa Parks said to him, "Get up, boy. Your name is Plessy. You have work to do." So he says in the last chapter of the book that I had no idea then what she meant, but I think I get it now. That what I'm doing now with the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, I think that's what she meant. That whatever I learn, I want to pass it on to the next generation so it can benefit them. And actually, in the afterword of the book, we list some examples of other organizations that are also trying to bring people together too. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now and hear from you, questions and comments that you might have that you want to share with each other.
Sure. Here is a question from an attendee. When did you first learn about Plessy versus Ferguson? Were you in 5th grade like Phoebe?
I don't think so. No, I don't think my fifth grade class in Baltimore would have taught us about Plessy versus Ferguson when I was in school, and I don't remember really hearing about it in American history class. I went to a really good public high school in Baltimore, an all-girls public high school, which is actually celebrating its 175th anniversary this year, Western High School. Um, I really first learned about it when I wrote a book for the same publisher that is, I guess I must have known about it, that uh, is publishing this book, Paul Dry Books. I was talking to Akshay about how did I connect with that publisher. We both went to college together and we sat next to each other in a social studies class. And when I started writing books, he asked me whether I had a book that his publishing company could publish. And so I just started working on a book about Baltimore civil rights history. And he said, go ahead. And he encouraged me I started first thinking it would be just a children's book, a picture book, really. And he encouraged me to make it a book for teenagers and adults. And so I started doing in-depth research into civil rights history, and that's where I read Keith Weldon Medley's book on the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And the book that I wrote, called Round and Round Together, about Baltimore civil rights, is about Black and white people in Baltimore coming together to end segregation at an amusement park. So I was primed to think about the idea of Black and white people coming together and working together to try to solve some of these problems. And so when I saw a newspaper story about Keith and Phoebe coming together, I thought, wow, that was a story I had to write about. And so I eventually got up the courage to contact them and ask them if they wanted to have a book written about them. And they said, sure. And so that's where this book came about. But I have found, actually, in talking to friends of mine, even some friends who are lawyers or very well educated, that when I mention Plessy versus Ferguson, they really have only a fuzzy understanding of what it's about. And many of them don't even know who was the good guy and who was the bad guy in it. So I think this book can really try to help adults, too, get a really clearer understanding of what that case was all about.
And what reactions have you heard from kids reading together? How are they relating this to current events?
Well, I haven't really heard from any kids lately, so I'm going to be talking to some young people soon, and I'd be curious to know from you when you do talk about it. Please have them contact me. They can reach me through my website, which is on the links in the chat. I really would like to know, and I know Keith and Phoebe would really like to know too. And if you have any artwork that you want to share with them, they kept that drawing that boy did. That was done several years ago from that visit that they made to a fifth grade class. So they would love to see your artwork. And if you write any poems or stories, maybe they could share it at their next Plessy Day ceremony on June 7th. They're actually planning a big event on May 18th this year. It's going to be a nationwide event open to anybody because this is the 125th anniversary of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And so we're going to have a talk for teachers again there for that. So if any of your students want to sign on to that, they can talk to them in person.
And here's another question. Do you have any suggestions for incorporating more books into lesson plans when the books might have themes or historical stories that some feel to be off limits or difficult to teach?
Yeah. Well, I think finding books that to deal with those in a sensitive way, and making sure the parents know that you're talking about those books is probably a good idea, and letting kids try to find the personal connection to those stories. There are more and more books like that are being published, and some do get challenged by some school systems. But I belong to a group called PEN, which goes and it believes in free expression, and so whenever there is a school board or a library that challenges a book on a topic that might be difficult or considered difficult by some people in the community, they go and try to support the idea of allowing that book to be available, and suggesting ways that it could be available. So I think getting, not surprising it on maybe on the school system and the parents and the PTAs, but maybe working with them to explain to them why you think it's an important topic to cover, and how you're going to be covering it in a sensitive way. But hey, you turn on the news and you're seeing these stories all the time that are really challenging, that just make you want to cry when you read the news these days, and you see the TV stories and the videos that people take of the news. So it's really hard to really shelter kids these days from stories like that. I remember when my son was in elementary school and there were some terrible events, and I tried really hard not to discuss them and not to have the news on. And of course, then the next day in school, the teacher talks about him. He comes home and says, "Why didn't you tell me about this?" So you can't shield them. You have to, but talk to them in a sensitive way, and treat them as people who have feelings about these things and can have their own opinions on it. I'd be interested to hear what you might say, if any of you have suggestions for how you've handled situations like that with challenging topics. What some people call hard history. But it's important history too, because as you see from this, it still is influencing life today.
Yeah, please do go ahead and put those in chat if you would like to respond to that question. And there's another question here that kind of relates to the presence of the past today. It says, in your description of Chapter 7, you put the end of Jim Crow in quotes. We know that the legal end of Jim Crow came with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but that segregation practices are very much still in place. How would you talk to kids about the work that still needs to be done in regards to reaching true equality?
Well, yeah, I think talk to them about how, these voter restrictions that are happening today, when in some areas where it's harder for people in Black communities to vote, like there might be fewer polling places in Black communities, or the polling places aren't open as frequently, or the different restrictions that are being placed on vote, and ask them whether they think that's similar to the kinds of voting restrictions that happened in the Jim Crow era. I know there's a lot of pluses and minuses on that. There's a lot of different opinion on that, but that's a kind of factual-based discussion that young people can deal with, I think, and can just look at the facts of the case, and then they can reach a conclusion if they think it's similar to, like in Louisiana, they had this reading test that was just impossible to answer. A group of Harvard students tried one of the 1964 reading tests that was still being offered in Louisiana, and just really confusing questions, and you had to do it in very short amount of time, and it was very complicated how you were supposed to write down your answers, and all the Harvard students flunked. And so those things were finally overruled in the Voting Rights Act, but when they were instituted in 1898 with the new Constitution, white people who may have had less than terrific educations were exempted from taking those tests by the grandfather clause. This was invented in Louisiana, the grandfather clause, which said that anyone whose father or grandfather was able to vote before 1867 didn't have to take the voting test. And so, of course, no black people were allowed to vote before 1867. Um, in other states, in North Carolina, they had a similar law that these laws continued up until the Voting Rights Act. So they can just students can just take a factual approach to this, and then what they might want to think about is what are the best strategies to do it. And so I mentioned this in the teaching guide when they talk about the strategies that the Citizens Committee used. They decided they were going to bring a test case and they were going to win at the Supreme Court. And so, students can then, look at, what kind of protests are going on today and think, well, how would it have been different if that case had come up today? How would the options that are available now for protesters today, like the use of social media, taking videos of problems, building support through social media, through demonstrations. So maybe what advice would they have given to the Citizens Committee, how they might have handled their case differently? Or thinking about the fact that there wasn't any TV back then, there wasn't photography that could really be widely circulated among people. Maybe that was the best they could have done. They decided not to. The other option that was open to them would be to going back to the Louisiana legislature and try to persuade them to overturn that law, but then they realized that that was the same legislators who had just passed the law, so it was not likely that they were going to convince them to overturn it.
I thought one of the... Oh, go ahead.
No, really.
I thought one of the fascinating details in the book was that Frederick Douglass had encouraged them to not bring this suit.
Right.
I thought that was a really fascinating detail, if you could talk about that.
Right. Well, I think he and others thought that, if they lost, then that would be used as a precedent for, and it did then become a legal precedent that was cited over and over again to justify those laws. But when you think about it, some states had already passed those laws before the Plessy case. It's, even if they hadn't pressed the case at the Supreme Court, Jim Crow was going to march along anyway, because by 1890, white supremacists were in charge of the governments in all the former states of the Confederacy. So it was unlikely that anything was really going to stop it. So what stopped it was NAACP lawyers filing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit on smaller issues, winning smaller issues, building a backlog of precedents and then of course with the Brown versus Board of Education, having that incredible study that the Clarks did of they had dolls that they showed to African American children. One doll, the dolls were identical except for one was dark and one was white. And then they asked them questions like, which one is nice, which one is bad, which one would you be friends with, which one would you like to play with? And the black children overwhelmingly decided that the white doll was nice and the black child was bad. And that study really struck at the heart of the Supreme Court justices, and they voted unanimously in Brown versus Board of Education to overturn segregation, that having that kind of an attitude about yourself that came from living in a segregated society couldn't help but interfere with their ability to, concentrate and do well in school. So, yeah.
We have two questions here sort of about your process.
Yeah.
As a writer, how do you decide that a subject is worthy of an entire book? And what does your research process look like? How much time do you spend researching your topic before attempting to write?
Yeah, I spent a long time researching, and I think it's whether it appeals to me, there's something about the topic that that I really want to spend a long time with, and also that I think might get published. That's a difficult issue these days. And I really thought that, wow, this story about Keith and Phoebe, I mean, how could anyone turn that down? But a lot of publishers did. So it was really, but I just kept going. And so the other thing is, if you're going to do books like this that are on hard history and difficult topics, that aren't on famous people, you have to be persistent. You have to keep trying. And so I went back to Paul Dry books, and they said this is an important topic, and they wanted it to be published. So, so that's for me. It's got to be something that I really, I sort of always sort of like fall in love with the people that I write about. I have to really like them and really like the topics and feel that the topics are important. And then, then I do a lot of research. I probably do too much research. I don't know. I really love research. That's probably what I like doing most. And interviewing people too. I just love interviewing people. That's the great privilege you get when you're writing books like this, that you get to call people up on the telephone if you have a publisher. And they'll talk to you and they'll tell you, about their lives and things that they've done, and it's just such a privilege. And that's really such a wonderful part of doing the research for these books, is learning about people that you would never get a chance to talk to otherwise, and you get to really see into why they did what they did. I started out in life thinking I was going to be an actress. That was my dream, was to become an actress. And well, that didn't work out. But I've come to feel that doing these books is pretty much what I liked most about being an actress. What I really liked about being an actress was learning about the characters I was supposed to be portraying and trying to figure out why they did what they did. And I did a lot of research, much too much research. And so I really wasn't all that good at actually portraying them in the kind of, just sort of letting yourself be part of the role. So I was much more interested in the research. And so then I realized that's what I do with these books, that I really do the same kind of in-depth study, trying to figure out why they did what they did. So I really like that. So what was the other part of your question? There was another part. Oh, how do I do the research? Oh, well, now it's so much easier with the internet. If someone says to you, you ought to read this book, and you can find the book right away very easily. And if you want to learn who was this person, you can go on Wikipedia. Now, you're not supposed to use Wikipedia as your primary research source in research, but at the bottom of Wikipedia, they always have these resource lists, and they list the books that they use to put the Wikipedia. So getting research is so much easier now than it was when I did my first book for Paul Dry Books. That was when Google was just starting, and very few documents were available online. But now that just makes it so much easier. Now you don't even have to buy the whole book. You can just get the Kindle edition online, so that your library shelves don't have to be buried under books anymore. It's been especially hard though this year to do and work on a new project that I'm working on, is because my library's been closed, and my library was wonderful, was able to get books on interlibrary loans. So if there was some academic title that was only available at some university far away, they could get it for me, and that was great. And that helped me in all the books that I did before the internet was really available. So this year I've started buying Kindle editions.
That actually was a question, is what projects are next on the horizon for you? So what are you working on right now?
Well, there is this book that I wrote in 2006 on a little-known civil rights hero, Sarah Keys Evans, who turns 92 on Sunday. And she did what Rosa Parks did 3 years before Rosa Parks. And she was a member of the Women's Army Corps in 1952 and was arrested for not moving to the back of a bus. when she was coming home from being on duty at Fort Dix in New Jersey, going back home to her family's home in North Carolina, and she got on the bus in the middle of the bus, where she was told it was all right to do because of the Supreme Court ruling in 1946 that said that was okay. But she wasn't aware that bus drivers still had the option of doing what they pleased on a bus and enforcing rules that the bus companies might make. And so she was unlucky to encounter one of these bus drivers on a dark summer's night in 1952 and was arrested and put in jail. And she and her family decided to fight back. And so they found a black woman lawyer, Dovey Roundtree, who took her case to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was supposed to regulate travel between states. And she won her case at the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was announced in November 1955, 1 week before Rosa Parks did what she did in Montgomery, Alabama. And so I wrote a children's book about her in 2006, which I could not find a regular publisher to publish, even though I had published several books for National Geographic and other major, publishing companies. But they said, some editors actually said to me that, we only do books on famous people, or we already have a book on Rosa Parks, so, that sort of covers it for us. So I published that book myself, self-publishing, which was kind of a new thing to do in 2006, but I had such a close relationship with this woman. I had interviewed her so often, and members of her family, and I sort of felt an obligation that she was getting older and that she deserved to have her story told. So I wrote that book, and now she's 92 and she still deserves to have the book told. So now I'm writing a book for grown-ups and teenagers, and I'm trying very hard to get a publisher for it. So that's what I'm working on now.
And you mentioned that you sort of knew Keith and Phoebe a little personally at this point and liked them. And there's a question about them. You said that Phoebe didn't know about her family history until she was a little bit older. Did you talk to Phoebe or Keith about how they plan to share their histories with their own families?
Oh, well, Phoebe's daughter does all the, is very closely involved in this, and I think her son probably is a big supporter of it too, but her daughter does all the graphic design for the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. And so there's this wonderful family tree for both families in the book, and she designed the family trees. They're really beautiful family trees. And Keith's family has been very involved in the whole thing. In fact, he has learned so much more about his family after he started learning about from Keith Weldon Medley. And that's, if anyone's really interested in this topic, his book is wonderful too, and is a really wonderful read. Through Medley, he found out about relatives that he never knew he had. Including white relatives, because his, I get all the greats mixed up, but his great-great-great-grandfather was actually a Frenchman who had white Frenchman who came to Louisiana by way of Haiti, as a lot of white French people did after the slave uprising in the 1790s, early 1800s in Haiti. And one of the brothers, well, they're not sure they were exactly brothers, but one of these two Frenchmen married a white woman, and the other one married a free woman of color. And the two families didn't really have much to do with each other until Keith found out about them through Keith Weldon Medley, who had been contacting anyone he could find that was connected to the Plessy case. So he knew about these relatives, these white relatives, and then Keith found out about them too, and then they connected. And he found out about another relative who has done extensive research and has found out that this French great great grandfather had actually served in the Revolutionary War, and so he now is a member of his mother. His mother has just become a member of the DAR because this great 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 or whatever grandfather, you look at I can never remember how many greats there are, was in the helped defeat the British in the battles that took place along the Mississippi River. And so his mother is now just became a member of the DAR just this year, and he's a member of a American Revolutionary Organization as well. So they learned incredible much about their families from having learned more about the case.
And I think we only have time for one more question.
Okay.
Is there a historical topic you've wanted to write about and haven't had the chance yet?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there are some about other. I have some other examples of people coming together across racial lines that I've just started exploring and need to explore more, because I think that's kind of an interesting idea. There's a quote in the book from Albion Tourget, which says, "Really, only if we work together is this ever going to be solved." And that really does seem like that's we've got to find a way that the Black community, the white community, and all the different aspects of these two communities can learn to work side by side together. And so more historical examples of doing that, it seems to me, might make an impression on people. So I'm just at the very beginning research into that, but I'm gonna look into that. If anybody has an idea for me, please write to me. I'll take anybody's idea and run with it. And I really thank you so much, and for doing this, for bringing books to the attention of these young people who are really interested in words. They're interested in words from a very specific kind of approach, but this can help them widen their interest in words and maybe see words as poetry and writing but good luck. I hope your kids. We bought for my sons the Word a Day, trying to help them. They would just never open it, the program, and so we have years worth of Word a day that were on their computers that they never opened. So I trust that your kids are better about that than mine were.
Okay, well, I think we're at 6, so thank you so much, Amy and Nathan, for being with us, and thank you for all the people who are attending. And we hope to have more of these events in the future, and please look in the chat for all the links to the teacher's guides and things like that.
Thanks again. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.